those who critique MMT, they never seem to acknowledge its basic premise, which is that all government spending is money creation, and instead frame it as if it's an option.
If you went to your bank and said, either of you, buy me that island in the Pacific for £1 billion, your bank would probably say no. Whereas the government can tell its bank, the Bank of England, to spend any money which it wants to, provided it's gone through the correct parliamentary procedures. If Parliament orders the spending of new money, this deal is going to happen. The Bank of England can't say no. All government spending comes by order. Taxes is an entirely different system. The tax department and the spending bit don't even have each other's phone numbers.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Reilly. Hi, I'm Christian Reilly and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. Just wanted to jump in here to let you know a couple of things. The first is the exciting news that Patricia and MMT co-founder Professor Bill Mitchell will be speaking at the launch of a new dedicated MMT policy think tank called the MMTUK Policy Research Group. The launch will be in London at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, the 25th of February at Friends Meeting House, which is near Euston Tube. And I'm told the launch will be recorded and uploaded at a later date for those who can't attend. The second thing you need to know is that shortly after we recorded this episode, some events occurred in Japan's government bond market. And so our guest this week, Dr. Phil Armstrong, has written some remarks about those events. So consider this an appendix to anything you might hear in the forthcoming chat about bond markets and currency prices. Phil writes, quote, "The results of the Bank of Japan's March 2024 ending of yield curve control were there for all to see on the 20th of January when Japanese government bond yields spiked in a broad sell-off of long-dated bonds, as the implications of all parties' election promises on government debt were assessed by traders. The sale of bonds drives down bond prices and automatically raises bond yields. As the monopoly issuer of reserves in Japan, the Bank of Japan always has the capacity to determine long-term risk-free rates. It can buy unlimited bonds at a price consistent with its interest rate target across the maturity spectrum, expanding its balance sheet in the process. The Bank of Japan enacted such a policy, namely yield curve control, keeping long-term rates at quote-unquote ultra-low levels for an extended period until 2024. This policy faced severe criticism from mainstream economists and the finance industry because apparently it quote-unquote distorted bond markets and reduced profitability. However, the absence of any significant inflation at least gave the Bank of Japan the means to justify the continuation of yield curve control. Sustained pressure was brought to bear on the Bank of Japan to end yield curve control during the recent bout of global inflation, which included Japan. Taking advice from mainstream economists who think of the Bank of Japan buying government bonds as quote-unquote money printing and that higher interest rates are contractionary when they're actually expansionary given elevated public debt-to-income ratios via the interest-income channel, resulted in the Bank of Japan wrongly ending yield curve control. Allowing markets to set rates based on quote-unquote sentiment and their views of future rate settings meant that the Bank of Japan would need to step in anyway. As Bloomberg reported, quote, "The choppy trading in Tokyo continued until last Friday when Bank of Japan Governor Kazuo Ueda said the central bank may buy bonds to stabilize the market. While that helps spur a rebound in long maturity debt, as long as the Bank of Japan governor does nothing, then we will see extreme volatility in the bond market, particularly the long end. The Bank of Japan governor spurred a rebound in debt by saying he may buy bonds. That's all it takes, end quote. Again, that reporting is from Bloomberg. Now back to Phil's remarks. Quote, the result was yields calmed a week later. As TD Economics reported, quote, Japan's 10-year government bond yield fell about 5 basis points to 2.24% on Thursday as a strong auction of 40-year government bonds eased concerns about the country's fiscal outlook. The sale of super long bonds this week attracted the highest demand since March last year, stabilizing sentiment after Prime Minister Sanae Takeichi's proposal to remove the sales tax on food for 2 years triggered a historic bond sell-off earlier this month, end quote. Again, that's from TD Economics. Now back to Phil's conclusion, quote, all this tells us that ceding power to quote-unquote markets doesn't end so-called distortion or improve so-called efficiency. It simply introduces unnecessary instability. Yield curve control was the correct policy all the time. We need more of it, not less, end quote. So that's Dr. Phil Armstrong's take and some context to bear in mind as you listen to the episode. In the show notes for this episode, I'll link to where you can get tickets to the launch of the MMTUK Policy Research Group and to where you can get tickets to Scotland's Festival of Economics, which is coming up in March and will feature presentations by Phil and Patricia. And as ever, there'll be a link to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMTpodcast. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. This is part 1 of a 2-part interview. The full-length interview is available now, along with many other patron-only episodes on our Patreon feed. Thanks as ever for your support and for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Reilly.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are delighted to be joined again today by our friend, economist and author, Dr. Phil Armstrong. Hi, Phil.
Great to be with you, Christian and Patricia, as always.
It's always our pleasure. So this is the second year we're awarding the Fauxbel Prize in Economic Commentary, which is an honour we like to award to what we consider to be the fakest of all the fake talking points in economics from the last 12 months. And what we were going to do this year was present the award at a live event at Scotland's Festival of Economics. The festival is still going ahead, but unfortunately our Fauxbel Prize event isn't, due to circumstances beyond my control. So huge apologies for that. But like I say, the festival is going ahead 19th to the 21st of March, 2026 in Edinburgh. And Phil and Patricia will be presenting there. And for those reasons alone, it's going to be great. And there will be other great speakers on the lineup, including the wonderful Professor John T. Harvey. It can be attended online, so don't miss out. So that said, just before we get going, I have to make the disclaimer that, like all the best prizes in economics, the Fauxbel Prize is in no way a real Nobel Prize. The full title is the Alfred Nobel's Fictitious Next-Door Neighbors Memorial Prize for Fabrication and Mass Deception in Economics. And it would be a real disservice to the awards and the distinguished panel if the only words anyone remembered from that title were the Nobel Prize in Economics. So again, just for clarity, this is not the Nobel Prize in Economics. Anyway, I'm going to kick us off with what I consider to be a strong but subtle front runner for the prize, and it's this phrase: the government can create money. Now, this is very subtle, but I'm objecting to the word can in that sentence, because the true statement is the government does create money when it spends. The government only ever spends one way, and that's by creating new money as it spends. All government spending is new money creation. But I think what's happening at the moment is that this truth is becoming more widely known, and economists and pundits who don't like this particular shift in public consciousness are having to defend their use of outdated frameworks. And they're doing that by saying something along the lines of, yes, we know governments can create money, ... The implication being that there's another way for currency issuing governments to spend, or that on some occasions, governments spend previously collected money, which is completely false. That never happens. But I think some economists are subtly implying that it does, so that they can then say, that's why we don't need to rethink any of our models or any of our ideas about what constitutes fiscal responsibility. So they're saying things like, yes, in special circumstances, in a pinch, the government can create money, but a government that does that is acting in an unconventional way, which is why our approach still treats the government as a currency user rather than a currency issuer. And often their takes will end with some iteration of course, the government can create money, but X, where X is a reason why we can't have nice things. So anyway, I know this sounds very nitpicky of me, but I think there's a world of difference between the government can create money when it spends and the government does create money when it spends. But I'll throw it over to the panel. I'll start with you, Phil. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a good spot. I mean, it's in the hunt. I was certainly thinking about that. I mean, it's a bit of a silly story, but when I was a kid, just after the Second World War, everything was black and white and we were all playing amongst all the debris. You could go to a thing called a fair. And when you went to the fair, you used to pay for darts, and then the darts you had to throw at the fair at a board behind the stall. If you hit 3 playing cards on this board, you won a goldfish, and the goldfish was given to you in a little bag. Now, this is kind of, some of the older listeners will remember this. When you got the goldfish, the owner of the stall wouldn't hand you the goldfish and go, the goldfish can swim in water. Because you might think to yourself, the implication is, well, it can, but it can also swim in other materials, like, I don't know, milk or beer, or maybe you can even live on land. What would be better to say to the kid in the grey shorts is that a goldfish always does swim in water. That's it. It's the only thing that happens. Now, it's a bit of a leap, but that's really exactly what you said, Christian, very eloquently, that these guys give the idea that, well, of course, we know that the government can spend money, but it's just an alternative, really. What they should be doing is collecting money, which the private sector's already counterfeited in taxes, or we can borrow money from them that they've counterfeited. And in all cases, this is the best way of doing it. What the government must not do, although it can, is print money because, as Milton Friedman said, that causes inflation. So the word can is a real contender because it's trying to suggest in our head that it's just something that can do but ought not to, rather than what they always do. A goldfish always swims in water. And for any pet owners out there, a little bit of a hint, indeed all fish, pretty much. I mean, 1 or 2 can pop on a rock, a blenny, I believe, but like anything you get from pets at home that's swimming in a tank, can, no, always does, yes. So that's my little penneth there, going back in time, Christian.
Come for the heterodox economics and stay for the aquarium advice, I think. And also this idea of any extra money the government wants to spend beyond what's naturally occurring, whatever that is money printing. I think Warren came up with this a while ago. Warren Mosler came up with the idea, look, if government spending is printing money, then taxing is the unprinting of money. Patricia, do you have any thoughts on this?
I get frustrated at those who critique MMT. They never seem to acknowledge its basic premise, which is that all government spending is money creation, and instead frame it as if it's an option amongst many. And the problem with that is that they say they portray money creation as inherently. Then they'll go on to say, if we do it like that, it's inherently inflationary, and then they'll lean a lot on the quantity theory of money to explain that. But if you see all government spending as money creation, then you can still have that discussion on inflation, but then you would have to talk about, what that money that is created actually does, and in what form does it enter the economy? It starts as reserves, and then the central bank carries out something called monetary policy in order to turn some of that into bonds and drain reserves from the banking system. And so then we can have a conversation as to why do we do that, and what's the point of bonds, and do bonds actually make inflation less likely? But we can't have that if they never want to have that conversation.
Behind the idea that the government can't save up its own money and therefore can't re-spend previously collected money is a thing we call the consolidated view. Now, for anybody new here, I don't know if I should turn to you, Phil. For anyone new here, could you talk about what the consolidated view is?
You mean the idea of like the government and the central bank being consolidated?
Yeah, that's right. And that's something that in your book, Can Heterodox Economics Make a Difference? That's something that you kind of pose to the various subjects that come up for interview in that book. And I found that quite fascinating, about whether they found the consolidated view useful or not. But yeah, could you explain what it is?
Well, basically, it's a sense of, okay, the government owns its own bank, the Bank of England, and has done since 1946. And that effectively means that it is a currency issuer in the sense that its bank can't say no. So that's what a difference between an issuer and a user. So, for example, you're a much respected man, Christian, and you're a very, very well respected lady, Patricia. But if you went to your bank and said, either of you, buy me that island in the Pacific for £1 billion, your bank would probably say, no, you haven't got the money in your account. Whereas the government can tell its bank, the Bank of England, to spend any money which it wants to, provide it's gone through the correct parliamentary procedures. Now, it's not that easy. It goes through a long, long chain of events, which is very complicated. And for those of us who've got lots of time and patience, I would at this point recommend Andrew Bartley, Richard Tye and Neil Wilson's Exchequer paper, so you can go and trace the whole process from beginning to end. But the essential thing is the Bank of England is consolidated with the government, so if Parliament orders the spending of new money, then this deal is going to happen. The Bank of England can't say no. They're legally obliged to spend that money. And so all spending comes from the government, that is. All government spending comes by order of Parliament, and it flows through the system. And then what would happen is, if they did decide to give somebody some money, they might give me some money, say £5,000. So I would get £5,000 in my bank account. My bank's bank reserves on the other side of his balance sheet would go up by £5,000, and that's all through government order. And it's got nothing to do with taxes whatsoever. Taxes is an entirely different system. I remember Warren saying that the tax department and the spending bit don't even have each other's phone numbers, which I thought was rather a good way of putting it. And so basically that's the system. Taxes just do the reverse and take money out of the system. So the government can't in any meaningful sense spend money from tax revenue. It spends money in, and then taxes take it out. But so the two disconnected processes, as Warren said, when you spend, you have a reserve add, or you add settlement balances in the UK, and when you have taxes, you destroy them. And that's how the system works. Now, the idea of consolidation specifically is this understanding that although the Bank of England is a separate entity to the government, they work together in tandem all the time, and they have to do. And to me, it's a very useful pedagogical tool, which is quite difficult to say, but I did all right. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that you can't go and have a look at the technical interactions between the two, because it's fascinating, which is what the three guys did. So that's my kind of perception of the consolidated view.
The reason I'm so zealous about emphasizing the fact that all government spending is new money creation is because I think that's the key reason why a government is not like a household. You know, there's a lot of emphasis on in politics at the moment on the left, which I'm very happy about, that we have to break the household analogy. And I think, well, yeah, you can keep saying the government's not like a household, but, you know, when people want to know why, this is the reason why. When the government spends, it creates new money. There is no other entity in the economy like that. When people talk about banks creating money, you know, commercial banks, what's happening there is your IOU as a private individual is being exchanged for their IOU. Net financial assets aren't increasing at that point, whereas when the government spends, it is new money creation. So I think that's something we should emphasize whenever, if it's appropriate. Obviously, you know, not if you're buying a sausage roll at Greg's maybe, but wherever it might be appropriate, it might be handy to break the household analogy by emphasizing that. And I also wanted to throw in there that from Stephanie Kelton's paper, Can Taxes and Bonds Finance Government Spending? You note the title there is Can Taxes and Bonds Finance Government Spending, not Do Taxes and Bonds Finance Government Spending. Quote, after carefully considering the complexities of reserve accounting, it is argued that the proceeds from taxation and bond sales are technically incapable of financing government spending, and that modern governments actually finance all of their spending through the direct creation of high-powered money, end quote. So the first one being governments can create money. It's very subtle, very easy for economists and pundits to throw out there to solve the cognitive dissonance of knowing the government creates money, but still needing to keep people afraid of the government running out of money. But I think it's important because all the other fallacies in economic commentary flow from it. And so in a way, this goes to bad talking point number 2, which is it's okay for the government to borrow if it's borrowing to invest. And this was very damaging because it slides past the audience the idea that the government borrows money from the private sector when it issues bonds, which is flat out false. We've just been over why the government can't save its own IOUs. The government can only spend by money creation. And so the money used to pay taxes or to buy bonds must have come from the government in the first place, or it's counterfeit. Even so, if you're a fiscally conservative think tank, which at this point seems to be all of them, or Rory Stewart, it's possible to bully progressive politicians over their spending proposals by redefining government spending more than it taxes, i.e. making a net contribution to the economy as quote unquote increasing government borrowing. So the way it works is a left-leaning politician like, say, Zach Polanski will be in an interview proposing increasing government investment in public schools, the NHS, public education, public transport. The interviewer will counter, you mean increased government borrowing? And then because it takes more than a few seconds to explain why the term government borrowing is a flat-out deception, the progressive politician will say something like, yes, but this borrowing is borrowing to invest, and that's how businesses grow, and that's how economies should grow. Look at me, I'm a very serious person just like you. Aren't we clever? So while it's not a bad idea to reframe government spending on public services as an investment and not a drain, I think it's an own goal. But maybe I'll come to you first, Patricia. What do you think?
What I really dislike about it is that, first of all, it misportrays what the function of the deficit is. The function of the deficit isn't to achieve some kind of growth in output. The function of the deficit is to ensure full employment. And so to say that you can only borrow to invest, meaning you can only run deficits, if those deficits lead you to grow your economy in a sense which is kind of compatible with capitalism, then I think there's misunderstanding the point of the deficit. I think it comes from this idea that you have to, in order to kind of make the debt sustainable, and specifically the interest payment on the debt sustainable, you have to kind of be constantly growing the economy. And it's this view of the government as a household, of course, that aids that. That again, that misunderstands the fact that we are the ones that set the interest rate. You know, we can set interest rates to zero if we so wanted. The kind of accumulated deficits over historical deficits are, of course, the total amount of debt, what we call the government debt. It's just the savings of the private sector. There is no harm with people saving. So I don't understand why we have to kind of make this kind of contingent on only certain types of investment. Obviously, we have to think about what our material needs will be today and tomorrow. And we have to think about what our standard of living is now and what our aspirations are for that standard of living and what materially needs to happen in the economy to achieve that. And we also need to think about what our resource constraints are and, how much room for maneuvering we have with extracting, resources, real resources. I don't mean money. All of that will have some impact on the kind of projects that we want to finance with government spending. But I really dislike that distinction between only certain amounts of government spending are acceptable and others are not. Even government transfers, which you might say carry the largest amount of risk in terms of inflation and are not productive spending in the same way that we are usually against interest rates on bonds because we don't think it's productive spending, but also because we don't think it's justifiable from an ethical point of view. It's actually quite regressive. But transfers can be justified in other circumstances where it leads to more quality, where when it's protecting certain groups that are vulnerable. All those things should be part of the conversation, and there's no distinction about you can't do that if it's borrowing, and also how can you tell what part of the spending constitutes the deficit and what part doesn't? It's all quite confusing to me.
Phil, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I might mention the guy that's always controversial and is the old Keynes. One of the issues about this old borrowing to invest, and I'm not saying it's the only perspective you can take on it, and whether Keynes changed his mind a lot and all the rest of it, and he was a bit hard to follow, but if you think about it, in Britain in the post-war period and immediately like during the war as well, you got this sense that while Keynes was working on this idea of, the need to have active fiscal policy, against the background, the Treasury view, the government mustn't run deficits and all the things we know about. But we were under a fixed exchange rate system. So the fancy term Skidelsky used was Keynes advocated a thing called bifurcating the budget, which is splitting it into two. Your current budget and your capital budget. Now, what Keynes was thinking about there was, well, the current budget was analogous to a firm. It gets revenue in for its everyday production. It's obviously got costs to pay, etc. So it really needs to have enough revenue to cover its costs. It would be a useless firm if it doesn't. So the analogy was that the government would do like consumption spending, like wages and things. And this aspect of a government's budget, just like a firm, should be in balance or surplus. Now, I take the point that Patricia makes, well, how do you know what capital and consumption is for the government? Isn't spending on teachers' wages and investment in the future? But we'll park that for a while because he had a reason for doing that. Then he said, well, okay, we then have a capital budget. And the thing about the capital budget is this is what we use for investing in the future. So we can actually spend more in that than we get in tax, so we can run deficits. But it's not bad because it's just like a business, and we would never tell a business off for borrowing money in order to build up its capital stock for the future. We all see this importance. Now, bearing in mind that's a fixed exchange rate system, and Keynes was desperate to keep the US involved with their Bretton Woods system. And importantly, looking back on the history, Keynes thought that would be enough. In other words, in the post-war period, this useful fiction would be enough to get us full employment. And in fact, in the golden age, it kind of was. So in other words, the government was prepared to run deficits and, unbalance the capital budget, it was called, in order to do so. So in other words, that system, although it wasn't an accurate description totally of what was happening. We were under fixed exchange rates, so we were constrained in terms of interest rates because interest rates had to be set to defend the pound at a certain level, which, we won't go into in too much detail now. Now let's fast forward. We now live in a world where there are no fixed exchange rates. The exchange rate floats. So the interest rate is entirely, as you say, determined by the Bank of England. The Bank of England sets the overnight rate, and it could, if it wants to, set all interest rates. So the whole idea of borrowing to invest and interest rates, it's all complete nonsense. It might have had a place, this type of argument, maybe, maybe not, under a fixed exchange rate system. But it has no applicability to a floating exchange rate system that we live in now. So it's an unwanted hanger-on. And that's why, for me, it's well in the hunt for the Fauxbel Prize.
So, on this issue of government so-called borrowing, and particularly in relation to this conversation that Zach Polanski had with Rory Stewart, Stephanie Kelton, in response to that interview, remarked, Zach needs to explain that guilt are a privilege, not an economic imperative or a fundamental human right. He should say he's prepared to take the privilege away or return to the tap system if bondholders abuse it, and he will not be intimidated because he understands that the purpose of issuing gilts is to establish a risk-free yield curve, not to finance the government, which is self-financing anyway. So we've been over the self-financing part, but I was just wondering if either of you could quickly outline perhaps the TAP system for people who are hearing about that for the first time.
Well, the TAP system is like, it's not an acronym, which I thought it just means like turning on a tap. So basically, if the government spends money, it leaves the reserves in the system, the Bank of England will just make bonds available at the interest rate that it sets. And then the banks have got a choice to buy them or they don't buy them.
So it's just issuing as many as are demanded and no more, basically.
Yeah. So if you want the bonds, you can have them. Great. And if you don't, well, you don't get them. So there's no choice. Well, there's a choice for them to have it or not, but they aren't in charge. Now, you might say, well, this is a great idea. And you will be right, because we used to do it years ago. Now, then comes on a sort of sideline, you might say, well, given that system means that the central bank is maintaining control of interest rates, it's saying, look, here are the bonds, the 2%. If you want to buy them for collateral reasons or safe asset, there you are, we're doing you a favour. Isn't that a brilliant way of doing it? And of course, yes. So you might say, why have we gone to the current system where the interest rate is determined by the bond traders bidding in auctions? That's entirely an ideological approach. It comes out of the idea that markets know best, because people will say, well, the Bank of England, well, they don't know what the real interest rate should be. There's a mysterious, great possible rate that's perfect. Some people have called it the natural rate or the neutral rate. This is a magic, invisible rate.
By the way, it's the natural rate because inflation stops accelerating and unemployment reaches its quote-unquote natural rate, which is
another nebulous term.
Yeah, exactly. Hundreds of thousands of people unemployed, and that's a state of nature.
Yes. It's out there, though. We know it's there. We just don't know what it is. Now, although the government doesn't know what it is, and even the wonderful markets don't know what it is, they've got a better idea than us. So what we're going to do is, in order to have a good chance of finding this long-run, magical, natural rate that does all these wonderful things, and it cooks your tea, and it does everything, really, mows the grass, what we're going to do is we're going to let the bond traders decide what the long-term spectrum is. So that's why we've got the system. A former senior economist of the Bank of England told me it's about a balance. So in other words, the balance is between the markets and the central bank. The central bank determines the overnight rate, the bank rate, and then gives the power to these wizardly clever people in the banking system through their bids who will magically come to the magic rate. Rather than getting rid of all that tosh, because they're only traders, and just say, no, the tap's on, You can have as many as you want at 2%. You don't want them, and then you can keep your reserves earning zero as it used to be. And now it would be the policy rate, and that's it done. So they're taking out the equation. Why don't they do that? It's just, as always, a political question. We've given the bond markets the gun, and we can always take it back. But we're not doing that. We've all got our hands up and saying, yeah, we're under their control.
Yeah, so to sum up, I think talking about the government borrowing to invest is an own goal, because by suggesting the government should borrow to invest, quote unquote, borrow, by suggesting that, you are suggesting the government gets its spending money from the private sector, which it doesn't. You're also likening the government to a business, suggesting the same constraints that apply to business, who are currency users, apply to the government, a currency issuer. That's also not the case. And more than that, your opponents will run with that framing and say things like, well, if the government's investing like a business does, then it should get the best return on its investments. And the best way to do that is to make government agencies subject to market discipline. So essentially, you're helping your neoliberal opponents make the case for the privatization of public goods and services. So it's a very damaging talking point on multiple levels, and therefore a very worthy contender for the Fauxbel Prize in economics.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible, and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going, and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in.
Our next contender, slightly related, is the public debt is a time bomb. Now, this comes from the economist James Medway when he was talking to Zach Polanski on his podcast. So in spite of what we all know, namely that it's impossible for the government to involuntarily default on any payment it commits to make, James wants the public to think of the stock of government bonds held by the non-government sector. We're the non-government sector, by the way.
Well, what would happen? What is it? What are we going to do with that stock of government bonds?
He would like us to think of those government bonds not as our assets, but rather as a time bomb that could go off any minute. So, Patricia, it sounds like you've got some thoughts on this. What do you think?
I just, the language is quite sensationalist.
Yes. Yeah, it's not helpful.
You know, it's quite scary, you know, but they've been saying it's a time bomb for decades, you know, in America at least, and here, I'm pretty sure. And it's only ever just, obviously, government debt just continuously goes up. And it's this narrative has always come up. I find interesting, actually, the current world affairs are a little bit of a mess at the moment, geopolitically speaking, and there's all this talk about foreign governments dumping U.S. treasuries and what a disaster this is going to be for the U.S. And you and I, we had a podcast here with discussing China a very long time ago, where we heard that China was starting to kind of exchange U.S. treasuries for other assets, kind of diversifying its assets, following the fact that the U.S. froze Russian assets, and then therefore China saw it as a kind of a sensible kind of de-risking of kind of diversifying away, because
if you can freeze Russia out, you can freeze China out.
Exactly. So first of all, that kind of highlights the fact that the US can at any point freeze your assets.
It's their bank.
Yeah, the record of who holds what in terms of assets denominated in dollars are held in the US. and the same for pounds in the UK. So ultimately, we hold a registry of who owns what. Now, I wouldn't advocate suddenly the government to kind of freeze people's assets, which is kind of a technical default if you think about it.
But not an involuntary one, which is an important distinction.
Not an involuntary one. It was very voluntary. It was targeted and voluntary. And in fact, the US has already threatened a number of countries with doing that. Of course, I don't think that's a good idea because geopolitically speaking, it doesn't inspire trust. It just creates more problems than it's worth. But at the same time, if China has been offloading these treasuries, but if you've noticed, they haven't offloaded them all in one go. Why would you flood the market suddenly with US treasuries in a way that it would cause, I don't know, the US dollar to collapse or whatever they think is going to happen, if that in itself is going to depreciate the value of the asset that you're trying to sell? So it's not in China's interest, or it's not in the holders of those people who own treasuries, foreign holders of the pound treasuries, to suddenly dump these things if it's going to depreciate, if it's not going to allow them to sell it, exchange it for other assets at a price that is beneficial to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the only way you can get people alarmed about government debt, which is non-government assets, is to really double down on that idea that it's exactly like personal debt. If your personal debt was so many trillion pounds, you would be in trouble. Yes, you would. But again, if we're serious about destroying this fiction that the government is like a household, you also have to challenge this one, which is therefore the money that the government creates is nothing like the IOUs that you might write or that you might accept. It's that we might write to each other as non-government individuals that don't have the power to tax and make our money worth something, which is, core MMT.
Yeah, the reason I was kind of mentioning those because that tends to be the biggest fear. It's not really about, obviously we don't need the bonds to finance government spending, but what they're fearing, or what I believe James Medway is referring to, because I believe James Medway agrees that we don't need bonds to finance spending. What he's afraid of is the devaluation of the pound because of people suddenly wanting to, sell everything in a panic, but it's really difficult to think about a situation in which people would want to sell anything in a panic unless we had suddenly got a Trump-like head of state starting wars all over the place. And, maybe then. But otherwise, what kind of progressive economic policy in the UK would cause holders of pounds to suddenly want to drop the pound in kind of to the extent that they damage themselves in the process? It's difficult to envisage such a situation, especially if the policies that MMT proposes are based on providing full employment, on protecting the environment, on having kind of a more sustainable economy, and also on making sure that we're using our resources as best as we can. I just don't see how, what is it that we're meant to be afraid of?
Phil, do you have thoughts?
Well, there's different ways of looking at it. One is, according to this narrative, a country's national debt is a time bomb, so the Americans are in trouble because they've got a huge debt, the debt clock, and they're all wandering around. And the implication is that the countries holding the debt have kind of, got power over you. They're the ones in command, like the US had to go to China, didn't they, to make sure that the Chinese would lend them the money, as Warren says. Now, in which case, if we're going to use that narrative, which is just a complete fairy story, but that's their story, that's their world, that the country with the huge mountain, apparently, of unsustainable debt is going to blow them up is in big trouble. And the countries that are owning the debt are rubbing their hands like a pantomime villain, and they're really in command of the world. They're the chess player with the queen and all the trimmings, and you've only got a few pawns. Well, I was just having a quick look on the major foreign holders of US Treasury securities. Number 1, Japan. Number 2, any guesses? Who's holding the future of the good old US of A in its hands? the United Kingdom. We've overtaken China now. So looking at this, we've got 8.5 billion, almost $1 trillion US treasuries. Wow. So I don't know what James Meadway is doing. And we're looking at that, he'd be rubbing his hands and saying, we've got all that US debt, roll over, Mr. Trump. At the end of the day, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, well, it's a time bomb, we're all in trouble. When, it's Britain that's holding loads of American debt. We've even overtaken the Chinese now. So the Americans are now in hock to us, not China. Oh, dear. So it's all a bit of their own fantasy land. So in their own world of craziness, we've beat them at their own game because we got all the US treasuries, so they're in our pocket, not the other way around. Now let's move to reality and leave their world behind. As we all know, we just said, the government spends by data entry, so all the bonds are just savings accounts that the private sector has amassed over the years. How are they a time bomb? They're actually fantastic. So they're all our net savings. So if the government, I don't know, over the years had spent, keep the maths simple, 100 million and taxed back 80 million, 20 million of that money is still in the private sector. So this is the national debt. And if we use that 20 million to buy bits of paper with interest, their bonds, those are our savings. It's not a time bomb. It will naturally grow over time because everything else goes up. We're getting richer in money terms. We need more savings in money terms. There is no time bomb. It's not a debt clock. It's a non-government sector savings clock. And that's the deal. There is no time bomb. Now, you might say, is it theoretically possible that the national debt of the government, which equals all of our savings, ever got so big to be a problem? Well, the government can always repay it, just clicks a button and reduces bond account and increases reserve account, done at a click. So you can always repay it. Could it ever be a problem? Well, I guess in a very, very long time, if the national debt is so vast, our savings would be so vast that we wouldn't need to do any work and we could all sit at home and listen to reruns of the MMT podcast. And we would never need to leave home and do anything. Now, all your listeners are thinking to themselves now, whoa, now that would be something. Are we anywhere near that? I mean, like anywhere near? Are people at the moment thinking, well, I'm so rich, I'm not going to do anything? No way. We're nowhere near that. And it's something we're not going to worry about. It's like saying, I'm not going to plan to go on holiday in 10 years' time because it might rain and I might get struck by lightning. It's about as likely as that. So it isn't a time bomb. The whole idea is ludicrous, and poor old James Meadway might be struggling when he looks at those major foreign holders of treasury securities. One thing I might add, I think, and this is interesting, I don't know what you guys think, I'm not entirely sure why James Meadway gets into a flap about the size of the national debt. I think it's because he thinks it's something to do with, because British banks or British-based banks have got debts denominated in dollars, that somehow affects the British government's ability to press a button on a screen to pay its bills in pounds. I mean, it has no bearing whatsoever. And also it works in reverse. He doesn't seem to be worried about the American banks that have got loans denominated in pounds, which is just the same thing. So he doesn't understand international banking. He doesn't understand the nature of the national debt. Apart from that, perfect.
I think this is particular to British economists, but I've seen it in other countries as well, where there's this fixation on kind of believing that if your currency is appreciating, it's a kind of an indication that your economy is doing well. I mean, it can be depending on what's happening, but it's not always the case. China being a good example of that. I mean, ultimately, the value of the currency, it's just another means of addressing an imbalance between your external and your internal sector. And so it's just a mechanism. and should be seen as that. The other thing I don't like is that we're talking about quick fluctuations in the exchange rate, which happen all the time and which are primarily driven by speculation, and which can be, of course, as you know, driven by whatever Trump says tomorrow, or whatever, if Jeremy Corbyn is at risk of becoming prime minister, the bond markets will go crazy, or the currency markets would go crazy, and as they have in the past. But there's a difference with that, which is temporary, and the volatility usually calms down once you have more certainty over the future, to permanent changes to the exchange rate that can kind of reprice your currency, and as such, well, it can have a long-term impact on your imports, and depending on how your economy is structured, that then travels through the production in your economy. It's the latter ones which are the ones that you need to be more concerned about, and I think that primarily responds to how your economy, what we would call the fundamentals in your economy, of your full employment, your price stability, and as well as some industrial policy. So depending on what industries you're investing on, that may have different effects on your long-term exchange rate. As you know, Phil, I think you and I have discussed in the past that the fact that a lot of our exports are services from the city, that kind of tends to overprice the sterling relative to what, say, other industries might need in the UK to be able to compete with foreign sector industries. Before Brexit, that was even worse because, well, I say worse, maybe they would regard it as better, in the sense that because there was less friction with Europe, the city had a lot more business, and therefore that was even, after Brexit, there was a big repricing of the currency. It was not to do with what they would say is the kind of the ability of the government of paying debts or whatever. No, it had to do with how it affected what was our primary industry. I really wished we talked about it in those terms more. So when James Midway is concerned about the exchange rate and say, okay, well, what is it that you think is going to have a permanent effect on the exchange rate? If we are really so vulnerable to fluctuations in the exchange rate, then shouldn't we prioritize fiscal policy that goes to address those vulnerabilities? Like he often mentions food imports and energy imports. Food imports, the way our market is structured, actually, pass-through inflation is a lot slower to come through than he imagines, I think. But energy is a quite important one, and is probably our most vulnerable, even though we are not as vulnerable, say, Japan is on that regard. But then we need to talk about investment, and simply making up a rule that we are just going to balance deficits somehow is going to prevent us from being vulnerable to exchange rate fluctuations, just simply by balancing the budget.
Yeah, or having some arbitrary fiscal rule.
Yeah, that's not going to do anything. We need to actively address that industrial kind of gap in order to make sure that we're not vulnerable, and that we're not as dependent on foreign imports and on energy particularly. And so I don't understand what strategy exactly he wants us to pursue here.
He hasn't really got a strategy, in the sense that if you don't really understand something, your natural inclination is to go to a catastrophizing, a word we've mentioned, like what is the worst case scenario? And you know what? It could happen. And then you get, like people say, I know it's on social media, well, if you do things which are progressive, you'll end up with a crash in the currency. Look at Iran or something. Well, there is no comparison, for example, between the UK and Iran in terms of exchange rates. The pound is a massively traded currency in one of the biggest foreign exchange centres in the world. And it's an overvalued currency anyway. And when you say, well, people say, what's overvalued? Well, generally they have like indexes, and like the McDonald's index. So, you work out what's the price of a Big Mac and fries in America and Britain, and obviously you'd see how much it costs in one and see whether one currency is overvalued compared to the other. So when you've done little things like that, you generally come across with the view that the pound is overvalued. So it should be, to equate prices in different countries, say us and the US, the value of the pound should be a bit lower. And as you say, Patricia, the city is interested in that. So our pound is slightly overvalued according to the economics, statistics and analysis. Now, it's always, on the news, if the pound goes down, it's, misery, And it's back to almost the imperialist days. It's a badge of our pride. But if you ask exporters, they want a lower pound because that makes exports cheaper so they can sell more. Our higher pound obviously supports city interests. No surprises there. So the idea of the pound is probably overvalued. Now, this idea about, if we do something good, the value of the pound will crash. It won't. What will happen is speculators run a bet and a gamble. It's like betting on a horse, and they close their position. So what would happen is, say, for example, they sold pounds, they'd have to sell them to somebody who's a willing buyer, and that other person's buying the pounds because they think they're going to go in the other direction. So essentially what tends to happen is the value of the pound will go up and down and fluctuate around a certain level over time. It's not going to crash to zero because the nature of our system is that people have to buy back into pounds. They're not leaving so, for example, if you sell pounds because you think that they're going to go down, you can find somebody to buy them off you. You then buy them back again to end up with more pounds than you started. That's the point of speculation. You've got to start off with more of the currency that you had to start with. And that's what happened in the pound. And I had a quick look that the value of the pound now is the same as it was in 2022. And it's fluctuated a lot. And it didn't take long for the Liz Truss speculative blip to go away again. So if we did have progressive policy in Britain, nobody knows. What do I think logically would happen? There would be probably a small fall in the pound, maybe 5-6%. Then people would start buying the pound back. And then it would go more or less back to what it was. And then over time, according to fundamentals, to use your phrase, Patricia, the value of the pound would tend to go up because we had a fully employed economy where, prosperity levels were high. The attractiveness on long term for the pound was going to go up. Fine. And on the inflation front, it's obvious if you look around that the major source of inflation in the British economy has always been fossil fuels and energy, as the main one. Obviously, if the value of the pound went down, it makes, these products go up in price. Plus the fact if the value of the actual cost of the oil itself goes up, irrespective of exchange rate, that drives the price up. So what's the obvious thing? Well, invest in green technology and make ourselves more energy sustainable, because if we don't have fossil fuels, then that cuts off that big source of inflation. And dare I say it, it's good for climate change policy. It's a win-win. So all this catastrophizing about the exchange rate, it's all based, again, on all of this catastrophizing, a lack of fundamental basic knowledge of the exchange rate.
You know what a time bomb really is? A time bomb is sitting back and not investing in our energy and not investing in sustainable, agriculture when we have a climate change crisis happening around the corner. And that may put all these resources at risk. And suddenly we may find one year that crops fail globally and, where's our food? And we need to start thinking about what is our plan B for having security here. China has a bunch of, obviously they have, agriculture, but they have also a ton of buffer stock systems for key agricultural products. We need to start thinking that way for resilience building. And the same with energy. We need to make sure that we have fail-safe systems just in case the worst was to happen. Unfortunately, the world is taking a bad turn right now, and climate change is not the only threat. So we need to start thinking while we're obsessing about the debt, we're completely ignoring all these other threats on the horizon.
Absolutely, yeah. So to sum up then, the government's so-called debt is not explosives. It's just the money that has been spent into existence by the government that hasn't yet been used to pay taxes. And the important thing in these matters is what happens in the real world. Are we investing for resilience? Are we investing for peace? God forbid. The next pecuniary piñata that needs beating with a stick until it bursts is government borrowing. Again, there's quote unquote. Government borrowing was okay when interest rates were low, but not now they're higher. This is a 4 for the price of 1 talking point. You get the audience to accept the false premise that the government borrows from the private sector. You get to imply the government has interest rates imposed on it by the private sector. You also get to imply that the government will run out of money because that's why it's borrowing. And it might not be able to afford its interest payments if rates go higher. And ultimately, you get to advocate for austerity because you're making the case for cutting government so-called debt. It's a good one for nominally progressive but fiscally conservative economists to use. Phil, Patricia, what do you think to this whole framework of characterizing bond yields as government borrowing costs? I mean, that is what's being said here, isn't it? That when bond prices fall, i.e. when yields go up, that's the government's cost of so-called borrowing increasing. That's what they're trying to imply, that, that they've had this imposed on them.
The interest rate is a policy choice. There's no need to increase the interest rate to entice people to buy bonds because bonds are inherently safe. But I guess there's this belief that interest rates manage inflation somehow. But if high interest rates means that there is currently high inflation, then some of that inflation may be best addressed through investment, which may mean more deficits, higher deficits, bigger borrowing. So it really depends on what is that you're, again, you need to focus on what your industries are doing, what the real resources are doing, and what the causes of that inflation is, the bottlenecks. Because I think this phrase is basically predicated on the premise that interest rates are high when you have high inflation, meaning that there is no capacity in the economy. We've reached full employment, and therefore there's too much demand in the economy. And on the contrary, we should be. It doesn't work that way. Basically, most of inflationary episodes in recent years have all been about supply side constraints and affecting a handful of industries or 1 or 2 industries affected geopolitically by some event. And that has then kind of traveled through the whole system, creating generalized inflation. So targeting investment and spending to key industries can actually help alleviate that inflation. I think this is quite short-sighted. Sorry, this is a very long-winded way of saying I don't like this phrase at all.
I think it probably goes back, doesn't it, to that, that mysterious rate, isn't it, that doesn't exist, but we think it's out there. If you think the mysterious rate that doesn't exist is really out there, then you think that you need to give the power to set interest rates to markets who don't really know that much anyway, but maybe slightly more than the government that doesn't know anything. Then moving on from the first mistake to the second mistake, then you think if the bond markets decide that interest rates are low, then it's okay for the government to borrow, which is the next mistake. Then the next mistake is the government has to borrow at all anyway because it's only using money it's already put into the system. So like you said, Christian, it's a real contender because you need 4 separate linked mistakes to make it. And boy, so you've almost got 4 poison ingredients in your cake there, haven't you? You don't want to be eating that one. So that's a nice one for the prize.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Reilly. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.
Oh, sorry, I was muted.
Oh, no, sorry. I thought I probably bored you into submission.
No.